Welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic, or the Recovering Pastor and the Heretic, depending on who's recovering today. Hi Dan, how are you?
I am fine and so far healthy, and I apologize for being a germaphobe because of you recovering.
I feel this is one of those things, you know how you feel worse? You feel worse, but you sound better when you're actually sick, but as you're coming out of it, you sound worse than you actually feel.
Yeah.
Like, I feel fine, it's just I've got all this congestion up in my sinus region.
Wow.
So
Yeah, I feel like getting all be gone, found
yeah,
congestion.
I know, yeah, right. So anyway, be healed. So fire away.
Okay. Yeah, and today, as we mentioned last time we were on, we're going to keep moving with the questions about Holy Week and how they were perceived back then.
Yep.
But we do have some questions from the audience that I want to do first before we get onto that track.
Yes.
And we'll start with Karen Harvey.
Yes.
She had a question about people with multiple wives.
Yes.
How does that play out in heaven? Do you hang out with like the most recent spouse,
Right.
or the first one, the one you love the most, or
Right.
is it like a harem when you go?
So the Pharisees actually ask this exact question, not the Pharisees, the Sadducees actually ask this exact question to Jesus. They tell him this story about a guy who about basically a person whose wife dies, then he marries, or a woman whose spouse dies, and then she marries the brother, and then that brother dies, marries the other brother, that brother dies, on and on for 7 times.
Yeah.
Right? And you're thinking, poor woman. And then the Sadducees go, whose wife will she be in the kingdom of heaven is the question that they ask at the resurrection of the dead.
And just to clarify too, the Sadducees were the ones that didn't believe in an afterlife, so this was like a double problem.
This is right. This is supposed to be a gotcha question, right? If this resurrection thing is real, how does this work out? Jesus' response is interesting because Jesus says there is no marriage in the kingdom of heaven. His exact words are, for they will be like angels, neither given nor received in marriage. So Jesus' answer to that question is, it doesn't work that way in heaven, right? Like marriage isn't evidently a thing. To put it another way, marriage is a gift we're given for, our Reformed brothers and sisters would call it a common grace bestowed upon the whole world for the sake of our earthly lives. It's not a eternal thing, right? And if you remember the wedding vows carefully, right, what do they say at the end?
Till
right?
death.
Right? I always remind people, they say, till death do you part. Like there's a terminus on your marriage vows, because there's an end date, there's a terminus on your wedding, itself, right? It is not it kind of ruins our like Americanized, romanticized love forever, but actually it's till you're dead, like, and it's wonderful while you're alive, but that's what it's for, while you're alive.
So in theological theory, then it's that you don't need that pair bonding. Everything that you get out of your pair bond here is already taken care of.
Right.
There, you've got that sense of unity,
right,
community, love,
value, dignity, right.
Yeah.
Relationship, right. All that is already present in the kingdom of heaven.
Okay.
Your marriage is, we don't say this often enough probably, but like the reason marriage is a big deal is that it's, from a Christian sense, it's actually meant to be advanced discipleship training. Like in the same way in which you are faithful to your spouse, no matter what, that you are forgiving to your spouse, that you are unconditionally loving to your spouse, because actually, you're supposed to then take these traits and then show them to the rest of the world, right? And so your marriage becomes this kind of advanced discipleship course, of like you're training for your behavior toward all people, and we probably don't say that enough about it, that it's not just about personal fulfillment, but it's actually about, your Jesus Christ, like the primary analogy is the wedding feast, right? Jesus uses for heaven. And Jesus' probably primary analogy to his relationship to the church is a wedding, And so it is supposed to show, just as Jesus is faithful to us, we then are faithful toward our spouses and faithful toward the rest of the world.
Okay.
So,
and since Karen is actually part of the live audience
yes.
today,
Does
that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
You're welcome.
Excellent.
That's what this is for.
Exactly. Hint, hint. So I want to carry that before I move on. How does that play out with, for example, in Mormonism? Is there also, and then in Islam, the concept of having 40 virgins with you?
I have
in
no idea because
Okay.
I just don't. The other religions I cannot speak to.
Okay. At some point we do have to have a roundtable discussion with.
Right. I cannot speak to them. That is all I can say.
Okay. Yeah, got to get
Yes.
rabbis, imams,
Yeah.
get other folks in here. Steve had a question about, and this relates to today's reading,
Yeah.
our story about doubting Thomas, who's my favorite apostle,
Yes.
the scientist amongst them. Everybody here in today's reading, Jesus comes in, they all know who he is,
Yeah.
and he's got the wounds, it's very clear.
Right.
2 times.
Right.
But everywhere else it's in the Gospels, including Jesus' own mom,
Yeah.
they don't recognize him when he pops up afterward. So Steve's wondering, what about that disparity? What's going on? I mean, come on, if your mother doesn't recognize you.
So the connection seems to be to the wounds, right? The wounds are the identifying mark. Allow them to identify him, so.
So that's why Thomas is focused on that.
Yeah. And so, he pops in and he says, peace be with you. It's the combination, right? The wishing of peace plus the visibility of the wounds, right? And so, I don't know, with Mary, right? Like, then he'd be like, hey, here's the set, like, check out the scar, like, check it out. Probably not, and so the wounds allow you to identify who Jesus is, would be my response to that.
Except, you're talking about an era where people are running around in sandals and not wearing gloves. So it seems like the wounds would be evident as soon as he popped up. It's like, whoa, dude, did you survive a crucifixion?
Yes, but like, to quote Shawshank Redemption, how often do you look at a guy's feet? Right?
Well, I'm an introvert, so I do a lot.
Okay. But most people don't, right? Like, how often do you look at just somebody's hands, right? Or just somebody's side, right? Like, and so, and like, Mary Magdalene is crying as she's like, as this is all happening and sobbing away, so how well do you actually look at something while you're sobbing, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll let Steve decide if that's good enough.
There's a
obviously I'm a little skeptical.
It's not just like the wounds identify him like in a there's a theology point, right?
Yeah.
Like the forever he is wounded. Like it's not like it's a scar, like they're open wounds. Like Revelation describes Jesus as the Lamb who is slain.
And
like,
so that becomes eternal.
Right. Like he's still wounded. The marks are still there. Which is how we know he is who he says he is. That it is only our God who takes on woundedness
And retains it.
and retains woundedness, right, as a piece of himself.
Is that the reasoning behind stigmata?
Yeah, similar. Yes, that's where
Okay.
you get that kind of mysticism, I guess I'll call it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've never been
Yeah.
clear on that. So with stigmata,
Stigmata
Is that permanent? When someone gets stigmata, do they stick around?
depends greatly, So stigmata is mostly a Catholic phenomena of people who, especially holy people who begin displaying the wounds of Christ, right? Usually they're open sores in their hands and feet.
Yeah, and I know we keep referencing our hands because of the popular thing, but it really would have been here, right?
Right, probably would have been here. But
is that one of the ways they can tell legit stigmata, is that they're in the wrist instead of the hand?
No, all I know about it is I do know the Catholic Church does a pretty heavy investigative process about it. Like, they actually search people who claim it. They actually search their houses for like chemicals. They got to make sure you have nothing in your house that can cause open sores, right? Like, as with all things, the Catholic Church is heavily bureaucratic about, there's a whole tight team devoted to basically disproving it, making sure that it's true.
Yeah. I'm visualizing a stigmata SWAT team.
Yeah,
that's kind of swinging in on ropes.
Swinging in, and so it's they try, like with demon possession and miracles, they try hard to say this isn't a thing before they get to it is a thing.
Okay. Now that part does appeal to me, right?
Yeah,
heavy dose of skepticism.
I thought it would,
Steve has a follow-up that maybe Jesus popping up in a locked house gives them the idea.
Well, right, walking straight through the door also helps, right?
Yeah. As long as you don't cross the streams when he comes in.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then our final advanced question, or audience question, is from Dot. And it actually helps us get right back onto track, because this is what my next question was going to relate to.
Yeah.
The Passover meal. So now we're back to our Holy Week stuff.
Okay.
And we're on Thursday.
Yep.
Although coincidentally, I want to point out that according to many religious scholars, today is the actual anniversary of the crucifixion. April 7th and April 3rd are the two dates they tend to bandy around historically.
Yeah.
So I thought that was cool. Anyway, so we get back to the Last Supper, and Jesus sends them out, get the table, get the room, and then prepare.
Yeah.
And Dot was asking, wouldn't the preparation of the meal actually have been a traditional role for the women?
I don't actually know about that. Possibly. It doesn't say the women aren't there, right? It just only mentions the 12 apostles, but it doesn't actually say they're not. There aren't more people there, right? Okay. So that's where I would start with that. I don't know what preparation customs were, back then, so I can't speak to that per se. And what was male and what was female coded role.
Yeah, if it was the men, it seems like it would have been a pretty awful meal because they didn't cook the rest of the year.
Yeah, I just can't speak to that, right?
Yeah.
All I can say about it is that there's a little bit of a timeline. In John, Jesus is crucified on Passover itself. This is the day before Passover, so the meal in John happens the day before Passover. In the other three Gospels, the Last Supper happens at Passover.
Yeah.
And Jesus is crucified the next,
Yeah, because the Synoptic Gospels, it's pretty clear that he's doing the traditional Passover blessing of the bread and the wine.
Right.
And then adding that extra line.
Right.
To and it kind of shocks them.
Right. And in John has altered the timeline because Jesus is literally the Passover lamb whose blood saves his people.
Right on the Passover itself.
Right. So he is crucified on Passover.
Yeah. And that does make it closer to actually 3 real days.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. But the math always bothered me in the Synoptic version.
It
ends up being like a day and a half, maybe
right,
2 days.
Right. Ends up being like 48 to 52 hours.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, the whole Holy Week saga is John's timeline. We're on John's.
Okay.
Actually, our timeline for Jesus' life, as much as we don't rely on John for history, is actually John's John's timeline.
That's interesting.
The only reason we say Jesus has a 3-year ministry is because in the Gospel of John, he celebrates 3 Passovers.
Ah. So in the Synoptics, he could have had a ministry for 10 years.
10 years or 1. You know, it could have been, if you read Mark, it almost feels like it's 1 year.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, actually, Mark makes it sound like it was 6 months in some ways.
Yeah, like 6 months, right? You know, and but so the only reason we say it's a 3-year ministry is because in John there's 3 cycles of the festivals.
Yeah, that's interesting. And at some point we'll have to circle back because I'd like to do a whole thing on John.
Yeah,
he's so different from the other Gospels.
He is very different.
Really want to explore that.
Yeah.
And we started touching on this with the horses or the colt, you know, going into the city, how orchestrated Jesus seemed to have. Yeah. And Mark reads with the Passover meal as well, like none of this is spontaneous. That Jesus meticulously planned the entire Passover Passion sequence. Even when you view it with that in mind, it even brings to doubt, I kind of read between the lines of what he says to Judas. So it almost comes across like he set this up with Judas in advance too.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible never says that, right? Like, the only thing you get is the line in John and the other Gospels where it says, the devil entered his heart. You know, like, as much as we like Jesus Christ Superstar, we never get Judas's motivations.
Yeah.
You know, other than the devil entered his heart, you know. There's a very clear point all 4 Gospels are trying to make, which is that the crucifixion is not an accident, you know, like, which is why it seems orchestrated, you know, like this doesn't happen to Jesus. Jesus enters it completely of his own power.
Yeah.
And enters it willingly, you know, and John, like, for example, in his telling of the story, goes at great length to kind of show how even at his own trial, Jesus is the one really in control, right? Like even before Pilate thinks he has all the power, but if you actually read the story, John's painting it in such a way that, like, Pilate sits Jesus on the judgment throne, you know, which is mocking, but what Pilate has just done is he's put him in full purple robe, crown, and on the throne.
Yeah.
You know, Pilate's unintentionally declaring who Jesus truly is. You know, it's like even Pilate trying to mock Jesus can't help but declare what Jesus truly is, right? You know, and so it seems orchestrated not because, I'm sure to many extent lots of it was, you know, again, he's a good community organizer, Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So, like, he didn't make it up as he went along, but it also seems orchestrated because there's a point about this is not an accident that happens to Jesus that could have been avoided. This is something Jesus, this is why the question people ask me, well, what if Jesus wasn't crucified? I'm like, well, he was going to be crucified because he was going to get himself to the crucifixion kind of from the beginning.
Yeah,
you
I mean,
know?
pardon the pun, but yeah, he seemed hell-bent on getting crucified.
Right, he was, you know, and so it's like, well...
He had an opportunity to defend himself, he doesn't.
Right.
You know, he's like he's the worst self-defense person ever.
He is, right, and like that only makes sense if you understand that he has all the power in this situation. He's just using the power in order to get to the cross.
Yeah.
You know, like the cross is a necessary step, you know.
Yeah, and this is where the faithful and the heretic in me collide.
Yeah.
Because up until the crucifixion, there's nothing really divine to me. In that if he is preparing, if he has plotted this out, you know, and the Gospels say, and this fulfilled the prophecy. Yeah. Well, of course it fulfilled the prophecy. He knew what the prophecy was, so he could arrange things just as a regular mortal person so that he was fulfilling the prophecies.
Yeah.
Where my heretic collides is I don't recall that the prophecies required the crucifixion per se.
No, I mean.
And so why would
yeah.
you do that? If you were setting yourself up
I
as a
mean,
mortal to have the role of Messiah, why would you then let yourself be killed right after you
Right.
fulfill everything?
Well, and so, right. So, you know, I mean, this is one of those things Jesus is constantly doing after the resurrection, right? As he's, you know, the road to Emmaus story is, you know, Jesus opens up to those two disciples on the road and he goes, you know, oh, you foolish mortals, you know, how slow of heart to believe everything that was said, you know, but it takes Jesus reinterpreting everything that was said about the Messiah in order to understand this is why we had to get to the cross, right? You know, I mean, Christians have always been pretty honest. This is a reinterpretation. You know, we think it's a faithful reinterpretation. We think it's a legitimate reinterpretation, but it does require, like, Jesus is a paradigm shift in how you read, you know, everything basically in Scripture, you know.
It's like the best mystery writers.
Yeah.
They lay out all the clues are there, and you interpret them one way,
Right.
but they reveal the doer of the deed in a whole different way, and it still makes sense.
Right, exactly. My favorite Old Testament scholar says, Walter Brueggemann says, the Old Testament leads inexorably and equally valid, you know, in an equally valid way towards two different paths. And like, one path is Christianity, you know, in the Messiah of Jesus Christ. But the other path the Old Testament leads you towards is Rabbinic Judaism. You know, and like they're both, I would say, and he says it, and I think he's right, that they're both equally valid. You know, like they are equally valid readings of the text. You know, you just got to acknowledge that they're both equally valid.
And go from there. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this. I want to circle back to it because it's so critical to the story. And that is that, you know, why does Judas decide to betray Jesus? It's so opaque. And you said before, you know, that back then they didn't tend to write about internal motivation.
Right.
But this is such a critical plot point
It's a plot
that,
point. Why
that
don't
it requires,
Right.
you know, that, and we don't get any of that. Is there a reason that the writers would not tell us that they wanted it to be opaque?
Yeah. I mean, again, like,
Because I can't imagine, like, you know, the apostles going around and saying, yeah, it was Judas, and that's all they say about it.
well, right. I mean,
I mean, he betrayed them as much as Jesus. They would have been pretty
yeah,
PO'd.
they probably were, you know. Well, they were. You can see what they wrote about him afterwards, you know. His stomach explodes in one of the versions, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, and Luke, or Acts, I think it's Luke. It's Luke.
Wow.
Yeah, Luke, his stomach explodes. In Matthew, he hangs himself, but
Yeah, the hanging is what I remember.
in Luke, his stomach literally, he buys a field and his stomach literally explodes as soon as he buys the field.
Wow. Wow.
Just, you know.
The ultimate ulcer.
Yeah, right. I mean, it gets back to ancient literature these are people who are the opposite of us in that they are not an internally psychological people.
Yeah.
You know, so like, it's just a question they wouldn't have thought to write about, you know.
Even on something that turns so critical.
Yeah, you just don't, it matters what he did, not
why he did it.
not why, you know. Excuse me. You know, the other answer is truly, you know, I think the authors kind of would say you could boil it all down. You know, we could look, you know, the Gospels paint Judas as greedy, you know, right? He's described as stealing from the common purse, you know, so you could talk about, oh, it was for money, or, oh, it was, like the popular one is that he's disillusioned in some way, right? This isn't the Messiah he thought it was going to be, you know.
Yeah, the superstar.
The Jesus Christ superstar, right, follows in this path, right? The disillusioned Judas, you know. But all that still boils down to the devil entered his heart. You know, like there's a deeper lurking of evil at work in this moment that ultimately I think the gospel authors would say, I could write to you about how he, wanted 30 pieces of silver, but but does that really explain any better why you would sell out a guy you thought was the Messiah?
Instead of just walking away from him.
Instead of just walking away from him, or just being disillusioned with what he say, really explain it any better than, the devil entered his heart.
Yeah.
And I think that would, in the end, that level of betrayal requires a kind of deeper evil to create your motivation.
And once again, we're almost out of time. I've only gotten through one more section of what so this Holy Week thing might last the whole year.
We have 7 weeks of Easter, so
okay.
It's only week 2.
But the follow-up then to that, in the broader picture, does grace extend to Judas?
Who knows?
I mean, both the concept of grace itself,
Right.
which, I mean, a ton of Lutheranism is based on that very concept.
Right.
But also the standpoint that when, and I forgot what the term is, when during the interstitial period between death and resurrection, when Jesus goes to hell.
The harrowing of hell, right?
Yeah.
Does Jesus go down?
So wouldn't Judas, that automatically also preclude that Judas goes to hell?
Yeah, that's a good, who knows? I think we should be open to the possibility that all are saved, right?
Yeah, because, I mean, clearly in the end, he did believe.
Right. Scripture says God desires. I have a friend who, I am not a universalist. I have friends, though, who are Christian universalists, and so one of my friends who is, he would say, Scripture says God desires that all shall be saved, and the question then is, does God get what God wants? Which is a fairly brutal but simple way of putting the question,
Or do the Rolling Stones apply to God as well as humans?
Yeah, right. Are the Rolling Stones immutable? You
can't always get what you want, no matter who
you
are.
So like, for example, in Christian history, Origen is a theologian who's both remarkably good and very strange. But Origen, and he was declared a heretic for this eventually, but after he died. But Origen argued that even the devil will be saved eventually, was Origen's argument. So possibly, I tend to think, my personal opinion is, it's not that the Rolling Stones are right, it's that God gives us what we want in the end, right? Which is, and so if you really, really want, grace is a gift that's universally offered to all people. But like all Christmas gifts, you can just chuck it in the trash.
I'll add this third complicating factor then, see what that is, the fact that he had to do it. We couldn't somebody had to be the fall guy.
Yeah.
Because if we had to have the crucifixion, if that had to happen,
right,
somebody had to be the catalyst to set that up.
Or did Jesus,
which again, gets into the whole, did he plot this in advance?
Yeah,
so either way, on that view,
right,
doesn't that clear Judas? Because...
Or does God simply know, does God know us so well that he knows...
The predestination kind of thing.
Yeah, how you're going to respond, right?
So he can incorporate that in the plan.
Right, right. That even to use the Lord of the Rings analogy, right? Like even the failed music gets worked into the overall jazz theme of salvation, you'll dance on the head of a pin on that one for all time, like trying to figure that one out. So I would just say that the mercy of God is higher and deeper and wider than we can possibly fathom, and all you can kind of say to it is what is said in the parable of the vineyard workers, Is it not his? Is that grace not his to do with as he pleases? You know, are we going to be jealous because he is gracious? You know, and that's about all we can kind of say about it. You know, so maybe, you know.
Just leave that one on a question mark.
Well, that's all you can say about it is. Karl Barth is a theologian who once said he doesn't think you can teach universal salvation, but he does say you can hope for it. You know, which I think is a good way of thinking about it. You know, I hope it's true. I won't teach that it is, but I hope it's true. You know.
That's another one I like.
Yeah.
Good. You pass.
Yeah.
And I know we were going to end on that, but Renee has a question she just put in. Says the crucifixion to her is a jolt to us. It fulfills the prophecy. However, the horror of it is a way to shine a light on our failures as humans in a lot of ways. And that then shows the extraordinariness of that gift of Christ's sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck Peterson is a pastor in the ELCA, likes to say, nobody comes away good looking. Nobody comes away looking good from the cross, you know, and that includes us, you know, and so, yeah, it is both good, right? I mean, Good Friday is not an ironic title. It's, you know, it is. Salvation of the world is accomplished on this moment, you know, and yet, yeah, it's brutal, partially because it forces you to really look at yourself, you know, and look at your role in that and stuff. So, yeah.
All right. Cool. I hope that answered your question, Renee, because now we are signing off.
All right. Peace.
So, yeah, and we'll continue the Holy Week discussion, but like today, if you have a lot of questions, get them into us.
Yep.
And we'll answer those first.
We will answer them.
Have a good week. Have a good eclipse day tomorrow.
Yes.